They say the only thing faster than a shifter's sprint is the speed at which a wealthy family can rot from the inside. Ivy went from the cherished daughter of a high councilman to a nameless servant in the span of a few years, stripped of her title and forced into the shadows of her own inheritance by a stepmother who viewed her existence as an accounting error. But Ingrid made a fatal mistake when she decided to sell Ivy to the royal territory to cover her own lavish spending. She thought she was disposing of a broken girl to a tyrant, unaware that she was hand-delivering the Alpha King his long-lost queen. Chains might be able to hold a wolf, but they cannot bind destiny. And when the king finally sees what they have done to his mate, the silence he commands will be loud enough to shatter the world. Chapter 1. The Mansion and the Dust. The marble foyer of the Gregor estate was cold enough to seep through the thin fabric of Ivy's worn trousers, chilling her skin where her knees pressed against the stone. She dipped the rough bristle brush into the bucket of soapy water, the scent of harsh lemon detergent stinging her nose, and continued her rhythmic scrubbing of the black and white tiles. Years ago, she had run across this very floor in patent leather shoes, greeting her father as he returned from the council chambers. But those memories felt like they belonged to a different life entirely. Now, the grand entrance hall was simply another expanse of surface area that demanded her sweat and silence, a testament to how far the daughter of a high councilman could fall when the wrong woman took charge of the house. Laughter drifted from the adjacent drawing room, light and tinkling like breaking glass. It was the sound of the pack's elite socialites, women who had once courted her mother's friendship, and who now drank tea poured by Ivy's trembling hands without offering a single glance of recognition. Ingrid was holding court today, solidifying her social standing while her husband lay wasting away in the medical wing upstairs. The sheer audacity of the gathering made Ivy's wolf pace restlessly in the back of her mind, a low growl vibrating in her chest that she was forced to swallow. To react was to invite punishment, and Ivy had learned that survival required a level of numbness that she had to consciously maintain. The double doors to the drawing room swung open, and the chatter grew louder before being dampened by the plush velvet curtains. Ingrid stepped out, her heels clicking purposefully on the marble Ivy had just polished. She was a striking woman, sharp-angled and beautiful in a way that suggested a predator lurking beneath a layer of expensive foundation. She paused just inches from where Ivy scrubbed, forcing the girl to stop and lower her head in a display of submission that burned like acid in her throat. Ingrid did not move her foot, waiting until Ivy acknowledged her presence with the silence of a well-trained servant. "You missed a spot near the skirting board," Ingrid said, her voice dripping with that faux sweetness she reserved for moments when she wanted to inflict pain without raising her volume. "The Countess is complaining about the draft, Ivy. Go to the kitchen and prepare another pot of the chamomile blend, and ensure it is actually hot this time. I won't have you embarrassing this family with your incompetence." Ivy gripped the wet brush until her knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to look up and scream that this was her family, her house, and her inheritance. Instead, she dipped the brush back into the gray water, the dirty suds swirling like storm clouds. "Yes, stepmother," she whispered, the title tasting like ash. "Madam," Ingrid corrected sharply, tapping the toe of her designer shoe against Ivy's hand. "You lost the right to call me family when you proved yourself incapable of contributing to this household. Now go. And use the back stairs. I don't want the guests to see you looking like that." Ivy rose stiffly, her knees cracking in the quiet hall, and gathered her bucket. She walked toward the servants' entrance, feeling Ingrid's gaze boring into her back like a physical weight. As she pushed through the swinging door into the narrow, unlit corridor that ran behind the walls of the mansion, she caught a snippet of conversation drifting from the open drawing room. "It is such a tragedy about Councilman Gregor," one of the guests was saying, their voice hushed with feigned sympathy. "To be bedridden for so long. Is there truly no hope for recovery?" "We pray every day," Ingrid's voice floated back, smooth and practiced. "But the healers say his mind is gone. He barely recognizes us anymore. It is a burden, of course, managing the estate alone, but one does what one must." Ivy leaned against the cold wall of the servants' corridor, her breath hitching in her chest. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. Her father had been weak the last time she saw him, yes, but his mind had been sharp. Ingrid was isolating him, cutting off his contact with the pack to ensure that when the end came, she held all the strings. Ivy looked up the narrow staircase toward the upper floors where the medical wing was located. The heavy oak door at the top of the landing was always locked now, guarded by Ingrid's personal staff, but Ivy knew she was running out of time. If she didn't get to him soon, the lies Ingrid was spinning downstairs would become the only truth the pack ever knew. She set the bucket down, the water sloshing over the rim. She wasn't going to the kitchen to boil water. The tea could wait, and so could the Countess. Ivy looked at the back stairs, realizing that for the first time in months, the guards were likely distracted by the catering staff bringing in trays for the party. This was her chance. She took a step upward, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, knowing that if she were caught, the punishment would be severe. But if she didn't move now, she might never hear her father's voice again. Chapter 2. The Fallen Councilman. The narrow servants' staircase was a tunnel of suffocating shadows, twisting upward through the spine of the manor like a hidden vein. Ivy moved with the calculated silence of a ghost, placing her feet on the edges of the wooden steps where the boards were less likely to groan under her weight. Every creak sounded like a thunderclap in the quiet corridor, amplifying the frantic rhythm of her heart against her ribs. She knew the layout of the Gregor estate better than anyone. She had spent her childhood playing hide-and-seek in these very walls. But the game had changed. Being caught now wouldn't result in a laugh or a scolding, but likely a night locked in the cellar without food, or worse, a fresh set of bruises to match the ones already fading on her arms. Reaching the upper landing, Ivy cracked the door open just a fraction, peering out into the wide carpeted hallway of the east wing. This was the family residence, a place she was now forbidden to enter unless summoned to clean. The air here was cooler, smelling of antiseptic and dying flowers, a stark contrast to the stale grease of the kitchen below. To her relief, the corridor was empty. Ingrid's private guards were likely downstairs enjoying the leftovers from the tea party, confident that the beaten-down girl scrubbing the floors posed no threat to their authority. Ivy slipped out, moving swiftly toward the double oak doors at the end of the hall that marked the master suite. Her hand trembled as she reached for the brass handle. It turned with a soft click, and she slipped inside, closing the door behind her and leaning against it to catch her breath. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn tight to block out the afternoon sun. In the center of the vast space, dominated by a four-poster bed that looked too large for its occupant, lay High Councilman Gregor. The sight of him stole the air from Ivy's lungs. He was a shadow of the powerful man who had once commanded the respect of the entire territory. His skin was the color of old parchment, stretched tight over his cheekbones, and his breathing was a shallow, rattling sound that filled the silence of the room. Ivy approached the bed, her boots making no sound on the thick rug. She knelt beside him, reaching out to take his hand. His fingers were cold and limp, lacking the crushing strength she remembered from when he used to swing her up onto his shoulders. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and stinging, but she forced them back. Crying would not save him. She needed him to wake up. She needed him to see what had become of his house, of his legacy, of his daughter. "Father," she whispered, squeezing his hand urgently. "Father, please. You have to wake up. It's Ivy." Gregor's eyelids fluttered, his head rolling restlessly on the pillow. He let out a low moan, his brow furrowing as if he were fighting through a heavy fog. Ivy leaned closer, her desperation rising. She could smell the metallic tang of potent sedatives on his breath, a scent that made her wolf bristle with suspicion. Ingrid claimed the healers were managing his pain, but this felt more like suppression. "Father, listen to me," she pressed, her voice a frantic hiss. "Ingrid is lying to you. She has taken control of the accounts. She treats me like a slave in our own home. You have to get better. You have to call the council." Gregor's eyes opened, but they were glassy and unfocused, swimming with confusion. He looked at her, but there was no spark of recognition, only a hazy, drug-induced stupor. He blinked slowly, a faint, lopsided smile touching his lips that chilled Ivy to the bone. "Ingrid?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. You look so young today, my love. Did you bring the medicine?" The name hit Ivy like a physical blow. He didn't see her. He saw the woman who was slowly killing him. She gripped his hand harder, trying to ground him in reality. "No, father. It's Ivy, your daughter. Look at me. Please, just look at me." "Ivy is safe," he mumbled, his eyes drifting shut again as the brief moment of lucidity faded into the chemical darkness. Ingrid said, "Ivy is at boarding school. Happy, safe." "I am not safe." Ivy's whisper rose to a cracked plea. "I am here. She is starving me." Before she could try again, the heavy oak door creaked open behind her. The sound was casual, unhurried, terrifying. Ivy froze, the blood draining from her face. She didn't need to turn around to know who was standing there. The sudden drop in temperature in the room and the cloying scent of expensive perfume announced her stepmother's arrival. "Touching, really." Ingrid's voice cut through the gloom, sharp and precise. "But I explicitly told the staff that the councilman was not to be disturbed. His condition is very delicate, you know. Agitation could stop his heart." Ivy turned slowly, keeping her body between Ingrid and the bed, a futile shield. Ingrid stood in the doorway, still wearing her hosting gown, flanked by two burly house guards who looked bored rather than menacing. There was no anger on Ingrid's face, only a smug, reptilian satisfaction. She walked forward, checking her manicured nails as if she were inspecting a chipped flaw. "He thinks I'm at boarding school," Ivy said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. "You told him I was gone." "I told him what he needed to hear to die in peace," Ingrid replied coldly. "Why burden a dying man with the reality that his daughter is a failure who scrubs floors? That would just be cruel, wouldn't it?" She gestured lazily to the guards. "Remove her, and ensure the cellar door is locked this time. If she disturbs my husband again, I will have you both flogged." As the guards stepped forward, grabbing Ivy by the arms, she struggled, digging her heels into the carpet. She looked back at her father one last time, praying for a miracle, for him to sit up and roar like the shifter he was. But Gregor just breathed his rattling, shallow breaths, lost in the dream Ingrid had built for him. Chapter 3. The Black Veil. The heavy iron bell in the town square tolled at dawn, a deep, mournful sound that reverberated through the valley and signaled the end of an era. Councilman Gregor was dead. He had passed in the night, slipping away quietly while Ivy shivered in the damp cold of the root cellar, unaware that she had already become an orphan. When the guards finally unlocked the door and dragged her out into the blinding morning light, the news was delivered not with sympathy, but with a laundry list of chores required to prepare the estate for the funeral. 3 days later, the Gregor estate was draped in black silk and solemnity. Rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the manicured lawns into a sea of gray mud, as if the sky itself was weeping for the injustice of it all. The funeral was a grand affair, attended by every wolf of consequence in the territory. High-ranking pack members, business tycoons, and even Alpha Kale stood under large black umbrellas by the graveside, their heads bowed in respect for the man Gregor had been. Ivy stood at the very back of the gathering, separated from the family cluster by a wall of guards. She was not allowed to stand with the widow and her daughters. Ingrid had forbidden her from wearing the traditional white mourning sash of a direct heir, forcing her instead into a plain, ill-fitting black dress that smelled of mothballs. From a distance, she watched Ingrid perform the role of the grieving wife with Oscar-worthy dedication. Ingrid wept into a lace handkerchief, leaning heavily on Prissa and Petra, who looked somber and dutiful in their designer mourning couture. To the outside world, they were a portrait of shattered elegance. Only Ivy knew the truth. She knew that just hours before, Ingrid had been ordering cases of vintage wine for the post-funeral reception. She knew that the tears were summoned on command, drying the moment the Alpha turned his back. The hypocrisy burned in Ivy's chest, hotter than her grief. She wanted to scream, to shift and tear through the crowd, to expose the charade. But she was one wolf against a pack that had already accepted Ingrid's narrative. Without proof, she was just the unstable, jealous stepdaughter Ingrid had painted her to be. As the ceremony ended and the guests began to file back toward the mansion for the reception, Ivy lingered by the fresh earth. She waited until the last of the black umbrellas had disappeared over the ridge before she approached the grave. The rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her face, but she didn't feel the cold. She placed her hand on the wet stone marker, her claws extending slightly to scratch against the granite. "I won't let them keep it," she vowed to the silence, her voice lost in the wind. "I will take it all back. I promise." By the time she returned to the mansion, the atmosphere had shifted from mourning to a subdued celebration. The guests were drinking and eating in the great hall, discussing politics and territory lines now that Gregor's seat on the council was vacant. Ivy tried to slip toward the kitchen to dry off, but she was intercepted in the hallway by Petra. The stepsister was smirking, twirling a familiar silver locket around her finger, Ivy's mother's locket. "Mother wants you in the attic," Petra said, her voice sugary and cruel. "She's decided that the West Wing suites are too large for just one person, so Prissa and I are taking them over. We need the closet space." "That is my room," Ivy said through gritted teeth, staring at the locket. "And that is my mother's." "Not anymore," Petra laughed, closing her fist around the jewelry. "Father, our stepfather, didn't leave specific instructions for every little trinket, did he? Possession is 9/10 of the law, Ivy. Now move your trash to the attic before I have the guards burn it." Ivy climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, her heart pounding with a mixture of grief and fury. The room was little more than a dusty crawl space under the eaves, filled with broken furniture and boxes of forgotten holiday decorations. It was freezing, drafty, and smelled of mildew. This was her new reality. The councilman's daughter was gone. Only the servant remained. She sat on a bare mattress in the corner, listening to the muffled sounds of the party below. They were drinking her father's wine, walking on her floors, and wearing her mother's jewelry. It felt like the walls were closing in, stripping her of her identity layer by layer. But as she sat there in the dark, a spark of resolve ignited in the center of her chest. Ingrid thought she had won. She thought that by taking the room and the jewelry, she had broken Ivy. But Ingrid had forgotten one thing. The reading of the last will and testament was scheduled for tomorrow. Elder Finch, the most rigid and honest lawyer in the territory, held the document. Ingrid could charm the alpha and bully the staff, but she couldn't charm a legal document that had been sealed for a decade. Ivy curled her knees to her chest, watching the rain lash against the small porthole window. Tomorrow, the game would change. Tomorrow, the law would speak. And Ingrid would learn that stealing a room was not the same as stealing a legacy. Chapter 4. The Lawyer and the Trap. The arrival of Elder Finch the following morning brought a tense, sterile energy to the Gregor estate. The lawyer was a man made of sharp angles and dry paper, known throughout the Pack lands for his unwavering adherence to protocol. He carried a battered leather briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, a visual testament to the importance of its contents. Ivy watched from the shadows of the upper landing as Finch was ushered into the foyer. He did not smile at Ingrid's welcoming committee, nor did he accept the crystal flute of mimosa she offered him. He simply checked his pocket watch and asked, in a voice like grinding stones, for the immediate presence of all potential beneficiaries. "That includes the daughter," Finch stated, his eyes scanning the room over the rim of his spectacles. "The biological daughter. Where is she?" Ingrid's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, smoothing the front of her black silk dress. "Ivy is unwell. She has been distraught since the funeral. We thought it best she rest." "The reading requires her presence," Finch countered, stepping around Ingrid as if she were a piece of misplaced furniture. "Fetch her, or I will go find her myself." Up in the shadows, Ivy's heart soared. Here was an ally. Here was someone who saw through the veil. She didn't wait to be fetched. She hurried down the stairs, ignoring the warning glare Prissa shot her from the drawing room doorway. When Ivy stepped into the light, Finch's expression softened imperceptibly. He took in her ragged dress and her tired eyes, his lips thinning in disapproval, not at her, but at the situation. "Miss Gregor," Finch nodded formally, "we shall proceed in the study." The study was exactly as her father had left it, smelling of old books and pipe tobacco. Ingrid, Prissa, and Petra sat on the velvet sofa, looking like a row of vultures waiting for a carcass. Ivy sat in a straight-backed wooden chair near the door, while Finch unlocked the cuffs and placed the briefcase on the heavy mahogany desk. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing against Ivy's eardrums. This was it, the moment of salvation. "Before we begin," Finch said, clicking the latches of the case open, "I must verify the inventory of the estate's liquid assets. There have been irregularities reported in the pack ledger regarding the household accounts." He looked directly at Ingrid. "Large withdrawals made in the councilman's name while he was incapacitated." Ingrid didn't flinch. She crossed her legs elegantly. "Medical expenses are costly, Elder Finch. Surely you aren't suggesting I would mismanage my husband's funds?" "I suggest nothing. I verify everything," Finch replied. He reached into the briefcase to withdraw the file. Suddenly, the door to the study burst open. The captain of the pack guard, a man named Hess, who had been accepting gifts from Ingrid for months, strode in, followed by 2 enforcers. Finch looked up, startled. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a private legal proceeding." "We received a tip," Captain Hess barked, his hand resting on the hilt of his stun baton. "An anonymous report of theft. Valuable heirlooms missing from the estate vault. We are searching everyone leaving the premises." "This is preposterous," Finch sputtered, standing up. "I am an elder of the council." "Then you have nothing to hide," Hess sneered. He grabbed the briefcase before Finch could protest, upending it onto the desk. Papers cascaded out, legal briefs, the sealed will, and with them, a heavy velvet pouch that landed with a distinct clunk. The pouch spilled open, revealing a diamond necklace and several antique gold rings. Ivy gasped. It was the jewelry Petra had been taunting her with just yesterday. Ingrid stood up, feigning shock, her hand flying to her throat. "My grandmother's diamonds. I searched everywhere for those. Elder Finch, how could you? I have never seen these before in my life," Finch roared, his face turning purple with indignation. "This is a setup. That woman planted them." "Arrest him," Ingrid commanded, her voice trembling with fake heartbreak. "To think, stealing from a grieving widow. It is sick." Captain Hess didn't hesitate. He slammed Finch against the bookshelf, twisting his arms behind his back. The lawyer shouted, kicking and struggling, calling down curses on Ingrid's head, but it was useless. The corruption in the room was absolute. Ivy stood up, shouting for them to stop, but one of the enforcers shoved her back into her chair with enough force to rattle her teeth. "Take him to the holding cells," Hess ordered. "We'll let the Alpha sort this out." As they dragged the screaming lawyer out of the room, leaving the scattered papers on the desk, Ivy looked at Ingrid. The stepmother wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling. She walked over to the desk, picked up the sealed envelope marked Last Will and Testament, and tapped it thoughtfully against her chin. The trap had been sprung perfectly. The only witness was gone, and the law had just been carried out of the room in handcuffs. Chapter 5. Shredding the Legacy. The silence that followed Elder Finch's arrest was absolute, terrifying, and triumphant. The heavy oak doors of the study were closed, locking the world out. Captain Hess and his men had departed with their prize, leaving Ivy alone in the room with the 3 women who had systematically dismantled her life. The air was cold, despite the fire crackling in the hearth, and the scent of betrayal was so pungent it made Ivy's nose itch. Ingrid stood behind the massive mahogany desk, occupying the space that had once belonged to Ivy's father. She looked entirely at home there, a queen surveying her conquered kingdom. In her hand, she held the thick, cream-colored envelope, the red wax seal stamped with the Gregor family crest still unbroken. It was the only barrier left between Ivy and total destitution. "You know," Ingrid mused, tracing the rim of the wax seal with a manicured fingernail. Finch was always such a bore, stickler for rules, no imagination. It's a tragedy, really, that greed got the better of him. "You planted those jewels," Ivy said, her voice shaking not with fear but with a cold, vibrating rage. "Petra had them yesterday. I saw her." "Did you?" Ingrid looked up, her eyes wide and innocent. "I don't recall that. And neither does Petra. Do you, darling?" "Never seen them before," Petra chirped from the sofa, examining her cuticles. "Ivy is hallucinating again, Mother. It's the grief." Ingrid sighed, a dramatic exhalation. "You see, Ivy? It's your word against the family. And considering your current status as, well, the help, I don't think anyone is going to listen." She cracked the wax seal. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Ivy flinched, instinctively stepping forward, but Prissa stood up, blocking her path with a sneer. Ivy watched helplessly as Ingrid unfolded the heavy parchment. Her stepmother's eyes scanned the document, her lips moving silently. As she read, her expression tightened. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a sharp, ugly scowl. "Sole beneficiary," Ingrid read aloud, her voice tight with venom. "To my beloved daughter, Ivy, the estate, the investments, the land rights, everything." She laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "He left us nothing. Not a single credit. Just a stipend for living arrangements contingent on your approval. He wanted me to beg you for an allowance?" Ingrid looked up, and the hatred in her eyes was a physical force. She wasn't just greedy, she was insulted. Gregor had seen through her all along, even if he hadn't been able to stop her. "Give it to me," Ivy demanded, holding out her hand. "It's mine." "Yours?" Ingrid smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She walked around the desk, the parchment dangling from her fingertips. She moved toward the fireplace where the logs were burning with a steady, consuming heat. "My dear girl, you seem to be under a misconception. This is just a piece of paper, and in this house, paper is fuel." "No!" Ivy lunged. She wasn't fast enough, or rather, Prissa was just quick enough to trip her. Ivy hit the floor hard, her chin striking the rug. By the time she scrambled up, Ingrid had already tossed the document onto the flames. Ivy watched in horror as the edges of the paper curled and blackened. The heavy cream parchment caught fire quickly, the ink of her father's signature bubbling and vanishing into smoke. The words "sole beneficiary" turned to ash before her eyes. Ivy reached toward the fire, ignoring the heat, but Ingrid caught her wrist in a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Let it burn," Ingrid hissed, pulling her back. "Watch it burn, Ivy. Watch your future disappear." Ivy fought against the grip, tears of frustration finally spilling over. She watched the wax seal melt into a red puddle, watched the last of the legal protections disintegrate into gray flakes that floated up the chimney. It was gone. All of it. The proof, the inheritance, the safety. Ingrid released her, pushing her back so she stumbled against the desk. "Now," Ingrid said, dusting off her hands as if she had just taken out the trash. "Let's be clear about your position. You have no money. You have no title. You have no proof that this house belongs to anyone but me, the surviving spouse. You are a guest here, Ivy. A very expensive, ungrateful guest." Ivy stared at the dying embers of the paper. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean of hope, but as the shock began to fade, a cold clarity settled in its place. Ingrid thought she had destroyed everything. She thought the will was the only tether Ivy had to the estate. But she was wrong. A memory surfaced in Ivy's mind. Not a document, but a day. Her 16th birthday. A party in the garden. Her father standing on the terrace, raising a glass, his voice booming across the lawn in front of 50 witnesses, including the current Alpha's father. He had made a declaration that day, a specific binding verbal contract regarding the west wing of the manor. It wasn't in the will. It was in the pack archives, recorded in the registry of deeds because it involved land separation. Ivy wiped the tears from her face. She stood up straight, smoothing her ruined dress. She didn't look at the fire anymore. She looked at Ingrid. "You burned the paper," Ivy said quietly. "But you forgot the land registry." Ingrid paused, her eyes narrowing. "What are you babbling about?" "The West Wing," Ivy said, her voice gaining strength. "Father deeded it to me separately on my 16th birthday. It's a split title. You can't kick me out, and you can't claim it." Ingrid's face went pale, the first sign of genuine fear Ivy had seen all day. The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a different battlefield. Chapter 6. The West Wing Decree. The fire in the study had died down to glowing embers, consuming the last physical evidence of Ivy's inheritance, but the sparks of rebellion in Ivy's chest were fanning into a roaring inferno. Ingrid's smug satisfaction wavered as the mention of the land registry hung in the silence between them. It was a detail the stepmother had overlooked in her haste to burn the will, a legal tripwire buried in the pack's bureaucratic history that not even fire could erase. The West Wing of the Gregor estate was not merely a collection of rooms. It was a separate deeded entity, a gift recorded by the council's scribes on a day when Gregor had been lucid, powerful, and fiercely protective of his daughter's future. Ingrid recovered her composure with a sharp laugh, though the sound was brittle around the edges. She dismissed Ivy's claim as the desperate ramblings of a destitute girl, signaling for the guards to remove her from the study. However, Ivy did not go quietly to the attic this time. She broke free from the guard's grip and ran, not to escape, but to the heavy oak doors of the main entrance. She threw them open, stepping out onto the portico where the pack's elite were still lingering, their chauffeurs idling in the driveway. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and carrying the sound of her voice as she shouted for the pack archivist, who was currently sipping brandy by his car. The commotion drew a crowd. Ingrid stormed out of the house, her face a mask of controlled fury, intent on silencing her stepdaughter before the scene turned into a scandal. But it was too late. Ivy stood on the steps, ragged and bruised, and publicly demanded the deed verification. The archivist, a man named Elder Corvin who had known Gregor for decades, had no choice but to intervene. He pulled up the digital registry on his tablet, the blue light illuminating his frowned face as he scrolled through the property history. The silence in the driveway was absolute as the socialites watched, sensing blood in the water. When Elder Corvin finally spoke, his voice was dry and factual. He confirmed that the West Wing, comprising the library, the solarium, and the 3 guest suites, had indeed been deeded to Ivy Gregor in perpetuity until her marriage or death. It was a sovereign section of the estate, legally distinct from the main house. Ingrid stood frozen on the top step, her knuckles white as she gripped the stone railing. She could not kick Ivy off the property because, technically, Ivy was standing on her own land. To evict her would require a council vote to overturn a deed, a process that would take months and invite the kind of scrutiny Ingrid was desperate to avoid after the arrest of Elder Finch. Ingrid's retreat was a masterclass in saving face. She smiled tightly, claimed she had simply forgotten the silly arrangement Gregor had made for his daughter's playhouse, and graciously allowed Ivy to keep her little sanctuary. But as the guests dispersed, whispering behind their hands, Ingrid leaned close to Ivy, her perfume cloying and sweet. She whispered that while Ivy might own the walls of the West Wing, she owned the electricity, the water, and the food supply. Ivy had her roof, but Ingrid promised to make sure it was a cold, dark, and hungry existence. Ivy watched her stepmother walk back inside, the heavy doors booming shut. She had won the battle for shelter, but the siege had only just begun. Chapter 7. The Fabricated Debt. 2 weeks of isolation in the West Wing had turned Ivy's victory into a slow starvation. Ingrid had made good on her threat. The power to that section of the estate had been cut, leaving Ivy to shiver through the nights wrapped in dusty curtains she pulled from the solarium windows. The water pipes had been shut off at the main valve, forcing Ivy to collect rainwater in buckets from the garden like a feral animal. Worse was the hunger. The kitchen staff, terrified of Ingrid's wrath, refused to sneak even a crust of bread to the West Wing. Ivy survived on apples scavenged from the orchard and the sheer, stubborn will to remain standing. She knew she couldn't live like this forever. Her wolf was weakening, the lack of protein making her lethargic and dizzy. On the 15th day, Ivy decided to force the issue. She still had rights as a pack member, rights that guaranteed a basic stipend for food and necessities. She washed her face in the cold basin, dressed in the cleanest clothes she had left, and marched to the main house. She found Ingrid in the morning room, reviewing the estate ledgers with a new, sycophantic accountant who had replaced the imprisoned Elder Finch. Ivy demanded her stipend. She cited the Pack Law, Section 4, which mandated that all dependent family members receive a living allowance from the estate's liquid assets. Ingrid didn't yell. She didn't call the guards. She simply gestured for the accountant to hand Ivy a thick, leather-bound folder. Ivy opened it, expecting to see a refusal. Instead, she saw numbers, rows and rows of them, all in red ink, totaling a sum so large it made her knees weak. It was an invoice. Ingrid had itemized every expense Ivy had incurred since birth. There were charges for her mother's hospice care, inflated by thousands of %. There were fees for her education, charges for the clothes on her back, and bills for the food she had eaten over the last 10 years. But the crowning blow was the maintenance fee for the West Wing. Ingrid had retroactively charged Ivy rent for the property she owned, citing security and structural upkeep costs that were completely fabricated. According to the ledger, Ivy didn't have a stipend. She was in debt to the Gregor estate for over 500,000 credits. The accountant pushed a document across the table, a debt bond. In the shifter world, financial insolvency was a crime that could strip a wolf of their status. If a pack member could not pay their debts, they became a bonded debtor, essentially an indentured servant to their creditor until the sum was worked off. Ingrid leaned back, sipping her coffee. She explained the situation with cruel simplicity. Ivy had two choices: be thrown into the pack debtor's prison, a hole in the ground where wolves usually rotted within a month, or sign the bond acknowledging her debt to the estate. If she signed, she would officially become property of the household, stripping her of her rights as a citizen, but keeping her out of prison. Ivy looked at the papers, her hands trembling. It was a trap. A legal, bureaucratic cage designed to crush her. She looked at Ingrid's triumphant smile and realized there was no way out. With a shaking hand, she signed the bond, effectively selling herself to the woman who hated her most. Chapter 8. The Deal with the Crown. The ink on the debt bond had barely dried before the rumors started circulating through the territory. The royal king, the feared alpha of alphas who ruled the distant capital, was expanding his household. His procurers were scouring the packs for staff, cooks, cleaners, laborers. Usually, this was considered an honorable position, a chance for lower-ranked wolves to earn good coin and see the world. But Ingrid saw something else in the royal summons. She saw a marketplace. Ivy was now a bonded debtor. Legally, her labor belonged to Ingrid, and like any asset, that contract could be sold. Ingrid began to hold private meetings in the library, hosting a severe-looking woman with the royal crest embroidered on her lapel. The pack whispered about what was happening. To sell a councilman's daughter, even a fallen one, was taboo. It smacked of the old ways, of slavery, which had been outlawed for a century. But Ingrid was a master of spin. She leaked stories to the local gazette painting Ivy as a troubled, rebellious girl who had bankrupted the family and volunteered for royal service to restore her father's honor. Ivy knew nothing of the specific deal until the morning the royal procurer came to inspect her. She was summoned from the scullery, where she had been scrubbing pots since dawn. The royal agent, a woman named Magda with eyes like flint, looked Ivy over as one might inspect a horse. She checked Ivy's teeth, checked the strength of her arms, and made notes on a digital pad. There was no kindness in the inspection, only a cold calculation of utility. "She is thin," Magda noted, her voice devoid of emotion. "She will not last long in the mines or the heavy laundries." "She is resilient," Ingrid countered smoothly, stepping in to salvage the deal. "And she is well-bred. She can read, write, and knows etiquette. She would be suitable for the interior palace service. Or," Ingrid lowered her voice, a malicious glint in her eyes, She would make an excellent example for the king's more disciplinary needs. The debt she owes is substantial. You can have her contract for a fraction of its value. The deal was struck right there in the kitchen, amidst the smell of stale grease. Ivy listened in horror as she was haggled over. She wasn't being hired. Her debt contract was being purchased. She was being transferred from one prison to another, sent to the royal territory where the laws of her local pack could not protect her. And the buyer was King Therion. The stories about the Alpha King were terrifying. He was a recluse, a warrior who had decimated entire rebellions, a man said to have a heart of stone. When Magda stamped the transfer papers, the sound echoed like a gavel sentencing Ivy to death. Ingrid turned to her stepdaughter, a smile of pure malice stretching her lips. "Pack your things, Ivy, though I doubt you'll need much. The king doesn't like clutter. You leave at dawn." Ivy stood rooted to the spot, the reality crashing down on her. She was no longer just a servant. She was merchandise, sold to a monster to pay for a life she never lived. Chapter 9. The Chains of Shame. Dawn broke with a sky the color of a fresh bruise, purple and gray and unwelcoming. Ivy had not slept. She sat on the edge of her cot in the servants' quarters, staring at the small canvas bag that contained everything she owned in the world: 2 tunics, a hairbrush, and a single book she had managed to hide from the library. The house was already awake, buzzing with a chaotic energy. Today was the transfer. Today, the Gregor name would be officially scrubbed from the territory. The door to her room banged open, and Prisa and Petra entered, flanked by the estate guards. They were giddy with excitement, treating the morning as a festive occasion. Petra carried a set of heavy silver cuffs, suppressors. These were not standard handcuffs. They were runed with ancient symbols designed to dampen a shifter's connection to their wolf. They were used for dangerous criminals, to keep them from shifting and attacking. To use them on a non-violent debtor was a gross violation of dignity, an insult meant to strip Ivy of her very nature. "Mother insists," Prissa giggled, tossing the cuffs to the guard. "She says we can't risk you running off and embarrassing the family before the transaction is complete. Put them on." The guard hesitated, looking at Ivy's slender wrists, but a sharp glare from Petra spurred him into action. The cold metal clicked around Ivy's wrists, and immediately, a wave of nausea rolled through her. It felt as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over her soul. Her wolf, usually a comforting presence in the back of her mind, was muffled into silence. Ivy gasped, her knees buckling, but she forced herself to stand upright. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crawl. They marched her through the house, out the front door, and down the long driveway. The household staff lined the path, their heads bowed. None of them looked her in the eye. They were complicit in their silence, terrified that if they spoke up, they would be next. Ingrid waited by the waiting SUV, dressed in a stunning red coat that clashed violently with the somber morning. She checked her watch, tapping her foot impatiently. "Get her in," Ingrid ordered. "The king's convoy is meeting us at the border. We cannot be late. First impressions are everything." The drive to the border was a blur of motion and nausea. Ivy sat in the back, the suppressor cuffs chafing her skin, while her stepsisters chattered about what they would buy with the money from her sale. They treated the credits Ingrid would receive not as blood money, but as a windfall, a bonus for getting rid of a pest. Ivy stared out the window as the familiar forests of her childhood rushed by, realizing she might never see these trees again. They arrived at the neutral ground, a vast, open plain of concrete and grass that separated the packlands from the royal territory. It was desolate, save for the wind whipping through the tall grass. Ingrid ordered Ivy out of the car. The wind bit through Ivy's thin tunic, but she stood straight, her chin lifted. Across the plain, a rumble began to vibrate through the soles of her boots. A convoy of black armored vehicles appeared on the horizon, moving with predatory speed. They bore the gold crest of the royal house. The king was coming to collect his purchase, and Ivy braced herself for the end of her life. Chapter 10. The king arrives. The royal convoy did not slow down until the very last second, the lead vehicle screeching to a halt just 10 yards from where Ingrid and her entourage stood. The sheer size of the SUVs was intimidating, military-grade machines built for war rather than transport. The doors of the flank vehicles flew open in unison, and a dozen royal guards poured out. They moved with a synchronization that was terrifying to behold, their uniforms crisp, their faces hidden behind dark visors, and their hands resting on assault rifles loaded with silver rounds. Ingrid's confident demeanor faltered for a moment. She had expected a bureaucrat, or perhaps a carriage. She had not expected a battalion. She smoothed her hair, flashing a nervous smile at Prissa and Petra, signaling them to stand up straight. This was a show of power, and she needed to prove she was not intimidated. Then, the central vehicle's door opened. A silence fell over the plain, heavier than the wind. A man stepped out. He was immense, towering over his guards, his shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. He wore a black tactical suit that did nothing to hide the lethal power coiling beneath the fabric. He wore no crown, but the air around him crackled with an authority that made the hair on the back of Ivy's neck stand up. King Therion. He did not look like a civilized monarch. He looked like a weapon of mass destruction given human form. A jagged scar ran from his jaw down into the collar of his shirt, a souvenir from some forgotten war. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, but Ivy could feel his gaze sweeping over the group like a searchlight. Ingrid stepped forward, her heels clicking on the pavement. She performed a deep, practiced curtsy, pulling her daughters down with her. "Your Majesty," she called out, her voice pitching up into that fake, sugary register. "It is an honor. We did not expect you personally. I am Lady Ingrid Gregor, and I present to you the contract fulfillment we discussed." She gestured to Ivy, who stood alone, shivering in the wind, the silver suppressor cuffs glinting in the gray light. Ivy did not bow. She refused to bow. She met the dark lenses of the king's glasses, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face set in stone. Therion ignored Ingrid completely. He didn't even acknowledge her greeting. He walked past her, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel, moving straight toward Ivy. The guards shifted, sensing the spike in their king's aggression, but they held their positions. Ingrid looked confused, opening her mouth to speak again. "The girl is a bit rough, sire," Ingrid stammered, trying to regain control of the narrative. "She is rebellious. That is why the cuffs are necessary. But she is strong. She will work hard if you apply the whip correctly." Therion stopped. He was 3 feet from Ivy. The smell of him hit her then, not ozone or pine, but something ancient and dark, like wood smoke and iron. He reached up and slowly removed his sunglasses. His eyes were gold, not the pale yellow of a common wolf, but a burning, molten gold that seemed to glow from within. He looked at the bruises on her arms. He looked at the rags she wore. And finally, his gaze landed on the silver cuffs binding her wrists. A low sound began to emanate from his chest. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a growl. It was a vibration, a deep, tectonic rumble of absolute, lethal fury that shook the ground beneath them. Ingrid took a step back, her face draining of color. The king wasn't looking at a servant. He was looking at the only thing in the world that mattered, and he was realizing that someone had dared to put his soul in chains. Chapter 11. The Scent of Rain. The wind howling across the borderlands carried the scent of dry grass and diesel fumes from the idling convoy vehicles. But to King Therion, the world had suddenly narrowed down to a single, impossible fragrance. It hit him with the force of a physical blow, bypassing his logic and slamming directly into the primitive core of his brain. It was not the cloying, artificial perfume the stepmother wore, nor the metallic tang of the suppressive silver cuffs. It was the scent of fresh rain falling on parched earth, mingled with the warm, sweet note of vanilla. It was a scent that shouldn't exist in this desolate place, a scent that his instincts recognized instantly as home. Therion stopped 3 feet from the trembling girl. Up close, the damage was even more apparent than it had been from a distance. She was alarmingly thin, her collarbones jutting out sharply beneath the dirty fabric of her tunic, and her skin was a map of bruises in varying stages of healing. But beneath the grime and the visible signs of neglect, her eyes, a striking shade of green, held a fire that the chains on her wrists had failed to extinguish. She didn't look down. She didn't cower. She met his gaze with a mixture of terror and defiance that made his wolf pace restlessly in his chest, desperate to tear apart anything that had ever frightened her. Ingrid's voice was a buzzing gnat in the background, chattering about the girl's durability and work ethic, but Therion tuned her out completely. He took a slow step into Ivy's personal space, the air around him crackling with suppressed power. The royal guards behind him shifted their stance, recognizing the change in their king's posture. The predator had found its focus. "What is your name?" Therion asked. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than the engines of the armored SUVs, a sound that seemed to vibrate in the asphalt beneath their feet. Ivy hesitated. She was used to being addressed as girl, servant, or debtor. To be asked for her name by a king felt like a trap. She looked at the gold fire burning in his eyes, expecting to see the same cruelty she saw in Ingrid's, but instead, she found an intensity that felt terrifyingly like recognition. "Ivy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. She cleared her throat and lifted her chin, refusing to whisper her own identity. "My name is Ivy Gregor." The name landed like a heavy stone. Gregor, the daughter of the late councilman. Therion's eyes flashed, the gold iris swallowing the pupil entirely for a split second. This wasn't just a debtor. This was a high-born wolf stripped of her rank and sold like cattle. The injustice of it fueled the fire in his blood, but it was the biological pull that consumed him. The bond snapped into place with a violent clarity. The emptiness that had defined his existence for centuries vanished, replaced by a singular, overwhelming need to claim and protect. He looked down at her hands. The silver cuffs were tight, digging into her ulna bone, the skin around them red and irritated. The sight of the metal touching his mate sent a spike of black rage through his veins. He reached out, his movements deliberately slow so as not to startle her, but Ivy flinched anyway, her shoulders hunching instinctively. That small movement, that expectation of pain, broke the last of his restraint. "Look at me, Ivy," Therion commanded, his voice rough with emotion. "Do not look at the ground. Look at me." She raised her eyes to his again, her breath hitching. "You are not a servant," he said, the words carrying the weight of a royal decree. "And you are certainly not for sale." Ingrid stepped forward, sensing the deal was going sideways. "Your Majesty, if the goods are unsatisfactory, we can discuss a discount. But the cuffs are necessary. She has a wild temper." Therion didn't even blink. He kept his eyes locked on Ivy. "The only wild thing here," he growled, "is the fact that you think you are leaving this transaction with your life intact." Chapter 12. Shattered Chains. Ingrid gasped, clutching her purse to her chest as the temperature on the plane seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Excuse me, we have a contract. The debt is 50,000 credits. You cannot just take the merchandise without payment." Therion finally turned his head to look at the stepmother. The movement was slow, predatory, like a tank turret rotating to acquire a target. His expression was devoid of humanity. It was the face of a beast wearing a man's skin, barely holding on to the leash of civilization. "Merchandise," Therion repeated, the word tasting like bile. "You stand there, wearing jewels that likely belong to her mother, and you call the queen of the Shifter Kingdom merchandise?" The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died down. The guards went statue still. Ingrid blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. "Queen? She is a debtor, a bonded servant. I have the papers right here." She fumbled with her bag, pulling out the folded document Ivy had been forced to sign. "See? It's legal. Her labor belongs to me." Therion snatched the paper from her hand. He didn't read it. He crushed it in his fist, his hand igniting with a brief flare of thermal magic that turned the legal document into ash in seconds. He opened his hand, letting the gray flakes drift away on the breeze. "The debt is null," Therion declared, his voice projecting across the plain so every witness could hear. "By royal decree, all debts held against Ivy Gregor are voided. And the creditor—" He took a step toward Ingrid, who stumbled back in her high heels. "The creditor is found guilty of treason for enslaving a member of the royal household." He turned back to Ivy. "Give me your hands." Ivy trembled, extending her wrists. Therion didn't search for a key. He wrapped his large hands around the reinforced silver bands. The suppression runes flared a sickly green, trying to fight his alpha aura, but they were no match for the power of a king. With a guttural snarl, Therion pulled his hands apart. The silver groaned, warped, and then snapped with a sound like a gunshot. Fragments of metal clattered to the pavement. Ivy sucked in a sharp breath as the heavy weight fell away, the sudden return of her connection to her wolf making her knees buckle. She swayed, dizzy with the rush of sensation. But Therion was there. He didn't just steady her. He swept her up into his arms, lifting her high against his chest as if she weighed nothing more than a child. "My lord!" Ingrid shrieked, panic finally setting in as she realized the money was gone. "You can't do this! The council will hear of this! This is theft!" Therion stopped walking toward his vehicle. He turned, Ivy secure in his arms, and looked at the woman one last time. "Tell the council," he challenged darkly. "Tell them King Therion took back what was his. And Ingrid, if I ever see your face again, if you ever step foot near the royal territory, I will not be as merciful as I am today. Run, before I change my mind." He didn't wait for her response. He carried Ivy to the lead-armored SUV, where a guard scrambled to open the rear door. As he settled her onto the leather seat, Ivy looked out the window. She saw Ingrid standing alone on the vast concrete plain, small and terrified, stripped of her power without a single credit-changing hands. Chapter 13. The Beast's Gentleness. The interior of the royal SUV was a fortress of silence and leather, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. As the convoy accelerated, leaving the borderlands behind in a blur of gray and brown, Ivy pressed herself into the corner of the seat, her hands clutching her bruised wrists. She watched King Therion from beneath her lashes. He sat on the opposite side of the bench, his massive frame dominating the space. He had removed his sunglasses, revealing those golden eyes that seemed to see right through her skin to the terrified marrow beneath. For the first 20 minutes, he didn't speak. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable but intense. Ivy waited for the other shoe to drop. She waited for him to demand labor, to tell her the rules of her new servitude, or to ask why she was so broken. Men like him, powerful, rich men, didn't save girls like her for free. There was always a cost. "You are shaking," Therion said finally. His voice was softer than it had been outside, losing the jagged edge of command. He reached into a compartment and pulled out a thick wool blanket. "Here." He didn't throw it at her. He leaned forward and tucked it around her shoulders, his movements surprisingly precise and gentle for a man with hands large enough to crush stone. Ivy flinched when his knuckles brushed her arm, and he froze instantly, pulling back to give her space. "I am not going to hurt you, Ivy," he said, settling back into his seat. "You need to understand that. You are safe here." "Why?" Ivy asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you call me that? Queen? Was it just to scare her?" Therion sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "No, it was the truth. Do you know the legends of our kind? The old stories about fated mates?" Ivy nodded slowly. "Bedtime stories. One soul split in two. But those are for powerful wolves. Not for me." "Status has nothing to do with it," Therion corrected her. "It is biology. It is magic. When I stood in front of you, my wolf recognized yours. You felt it too, didn't you? The pull?" Ivy looked down at her hands. She had felt it. A strange magnetic heat that made her want to step closer to him despite her fear. I felt something, she admitted. But I don't understand. I'm broken, Your Majesty. I have nothing to offer a king. You don't need to offer me anything, Therion said fiercely. You are the offering. The moon gave you to me. He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his face level with hers. I know you are scared. I know you have been hurt. I can smell the pain on you, and it makes me want to burn the world down. But I need you to trust me. Just a little. Just enough to let me take you home. He reached out his hand, palm up, resting it on the center console between them. It was an invitation, not a demand. Ivy looked at his scars, at the strength in his fingers, and then at her own trembling hand. Slowly, fighting every survival instinct that told her to hide, she reached out. When her fingers brushed his, a spark of warmth traveled up her arm, settling in her chest like a glowing ember. Therion didn't close his hand around hers. He let her set the pace, his thumb gently brushing her knuckles in a soothing rhythm. Rest now, he murmured. It's a long drive to the capital. No one will touch you while I breathe. Chapter 14. The Palace of Glass. The royal capital was a sprawling metropolis of steel and light, built into the base of the great northern mountains, but Ivy saw none of it. She had fallen into a fitful, exhausted sleep the moment the adrenaline faded, her hand still loosely clasping the king's. She only woke when the motion of the vehicle stopped. Her eyes snapped open, panic surging instantly as she forgot where she was, but the warm, solid presence beside her grounded her before she could hyperventilate. We are here, Therion said softly. Look. He gestured out the tinted window. They were parked in a circular driveway paved with white stone. Looming above them was the Palace of Glass, a structure that looked less like a building and more like a frozen waterfall. Walls of sheer reinforced glass rose hundreds of feet into the air, reflecting the mountains and the sky. It was breathtaking, pristine, and terrifyingly open. The door opened, and Therion stepped out, turning immediately to offer her his hand. Ivy took it, stepping down onto the white stone. Her boots were muddy, her tunic stained with grease. She felt like a blemish on a perfect painting. A line of staff stood waiting on the stairs, and Ivy instinctively tried to shrink behind Therion's massive bulk. But Therion did not hide her. He stepped aside, placing a hand on the small of her back to gently push her forward. Standing at the base of the stairs was a group of 6 warriors in matte black armor, their faces serious, their energy lethal. They were the elite guard, the king's personal shadows. Attention, Therion barked. The 6 warriors snapped their heels together, the sound echoing off the glass walls. This is Ivy, Therion announced, his voice carrying the full weight of his alpha authority. She is my mate. She is your Luna. He looked at the captain of the guard, a scarred wolf named Kalen. From this moment forward, her safety is your primary objective. Her command is my command. If she tells you to burn this palace to the ground, you ask her for the matches. Do you understand? Sir, yes, sir, the guards shouted in unison, slamming their fists over their hearts. They bowed to Ivy, not a polite nod, but a deep warrior's bow of absolute submission. Ivy stood frozen, her heart hammering. They were bowing to her, to the girl who had cleaned toilets yesterday. And this, Therion continued, gesturing to a stern woman in a gray suit who stepped forward, is Martha, the head of household. She will see to your immediate needs. Martha bowed low. Welcome home, Your Majesty. Your Luna. We have prepared the medical wing as you requested. Dr. Eris is waiting. Therion nodded, his hand tightening slightly on Ivy's back. Good. We go there first. I want a full assessment. Ivy looked up at him. Medical wing? You are hurt, Ivy, Therion said, his face tightening. I need to know the extent of it. I need to know how to fix it. Chapter 15. Scars and Oaths. The medical wing of the palace was more advanced than any hospital Ivy had ever seen. It smelled of antiseptic and ozone, filled with humming machinery and displays of holographic vitals. Dr. Aris, a calm, elderly beta wolf with kind eyes, ran the scanner over Ivy's body in silence. Therion stood in the corner of the examination room, his arms crossed over his chest, his presence filling the room with a suffocating tension. He watched every readout, every grimace on the doctor's face. When the exam was finished, Ivy sat on the edge of the biobed, clutching a sterile gown to her chest. Dr. Aris typed up the final report and handed the datapad to the king. Therion took it, his eyes scanning the list of injuries. Malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, 3 improperly healed rib fractures, extensive scarring on the dorsal region consistent with whipping, ligament damage in the wrists from prolonged restraint, evidence of an untreated concussion. Therion read the list, and the air in the room began to vibrate. The datapad cracked in his hand, the screen spiderwebbing under the pressure of his grip. He didn't say a word. He turned and walked out of the exam room, heading straight for his private office across the hall. Ivy exchanged a worried look with the doctor. Is he angry with me? No, child, Aris said softly. He is angry at himself, and at them. A crash echoed from the office. Then another, the sound of heavy wood splintering and glass shattering. Therion was destroying the room. Ivy slid off the bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor. I have to go to him. Luna, you should rest, the doctor warned. An alpha in a rage state is dangerous. He won't hurt me, Ivy said, realizing with sudden clarity that it was true. She walked out of the medical bay and into the office. The room was a disaster zone. The heavy oak desk had been overturned and smashed in half. Books were scattered everywhere. Therion stood in the center of the wreckage, heaving, his claws extended, ready to tear down the curtains. He looked wild, consumed by the knowledge of her suffering and his inability to have prevented it. Therion! Ivy called out. He didn't stop. He grabbed a heavy marble statue and prepared to hurl it through the window. I will kill them all, he roared, his voice shaking the walls. I will burn their territory to ash. Ivy realized that his rage was feeding on itself, a loop of alpha aggression that would only escalate until he exhausted himself. She needed to reach him. She needed to be more than a victim. She straightened her spine, ignoring the pain in her ribs, and let her wolf, the wolf of a high councilman's daughter, the wolf of a queen, rise to the surface. Therion, put it down. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. She used the Luna voice, a specific tone of authority that resonated with the pack magic inherent in high-ranking females. It hit the room like a shockwave. Therion froze. The statue hovered in his hand. He turned slowly, his golden eyes wide with shock. He hadn't heard a mouse squeak. He had heard an equal. Put it down, Ivy repeated, her voice steady and steel-hard. You are scaring the staff, and you are scaring me. Therion blinked, the golden haze receding slightly. He slowly lowered the statue to the floor. His shoulders slumped. I saw the report, he whispered, his voice broken. The things they did to you. Ivy, how can you stand there and not want the world to burn? Because I survived, Ivy said, stepping over the debris of the broken desk to reach him. She took his large, trembling hand in hers. I survived them. I survived the cold. I survived the hunger. Do not let them break you now. If you destroy this room, if you destroy yourself with rage, then Ingrid wins. And I will not let her win. Therion looked down at her, seeing not a broken girl, but a warrior made of steel and grace. He fell to his knees before her, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. I swear to you, he vowed into the fabric of her gown. I will never let you feel pain again. I will spend the rest of my life making up for the years I missed. Ivy rested her hand on his head, feeling the immense power of the king submit to her touch. Start by standing up, she whispered. We have a kingdom to rule. Chapter 16. The Wolf Awakens. The royal training grounds were vast, a sprawl of green turf and tactical obstacle courses bordered by the dense, ancient forest that hugged the base of the mountains. For the first week of her stay at the palace, Ivy had only viewed this space from behind the safety of her glass balcony, watching the king's elite soldiers run drills with a precision that was both mesmerizing and intimidating. But today, the glass barrier was gone. She stood on the dew-soaked grass, the morning air biting at her cheeks, wearing a set of thermal training gear that Therion had commissioned specifically for her frame. Recovery had been a slow, agonizing process. The healers had mended her ribs and treated the deep tissue damage on her back, but the atrophy of her muscles, and her spirit, was harder to fix. Therion, however, treated her recovery with the same intensity he applied to warfare. He didn't coddle her. He challenged her. He understood that pity would only remind her of her victimhood, while strength would give her a future. Again, Therion said, his voice calm but firm. He stood 10 feet away, holding a padded strike target. Don't just push it, Ivy. Strike through it. Ivy wiped the sweat from her forehead, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but the fire in her gut, a spark that had been nearly extinguished in the attic, was beginning to burn hotter. She reset her stance, grounding her heels into the turf as he had taught her. She wasn't imagining the target. She was imagining the heavy oak door of the cellar. She was imagining the sneer on Prissa's face. She pivoted, throwing her weight behind the punch. Her fist connected with the pad with a solid, resounding thwack that echoed across the quiet field. The impact jarred her shoulder, but it felt good. It felt like agency. Therion lowered the pad, a glint of approval in his golden eyes. Better. You stopped apologizing before you hit. That is progress. He tossed the pad aside and walked toward her. The chemistry between them was palpable, a constant, low-frequency hum that seemed to charge the air. In the weeks since he had carried her out of the borderlands, their relationship had evolved from savior and survivor into something deeper. It wasn't just the mating bond. It was a partnership forged in the quiet moments, shared meals, late-night conversations about history and politics, and the silent understanding of two souls who had known loneliness. My wolf, Ivy said, catching her breath. She feels restless. Since the cuffs came off, it's like she's pacing inside my chest. But I'm afraid to let her out. I haven't shifted in 3 years. What if I can't control it? Control is a myth, Therion replied, handing her a bottle of water. We don't control the wolf. We harmonize with it. You have been living in fear, and your wolf has been living in a cage. She is angry, Ivy, and she has every right to be. You need to let her run. He stepped back, stripping off his black tactical shirt. Ivy watched, her heart skipping a beat, as he closed his eyes. The shift was seamless, a ripple of magic and muscle that transformed the man into the massive black wolf in seconds. He shook his dark fur, letting out a playful huff, and looked at her expectantly. Ivy closed her eyes. She reached for the pacing anxiety inside her, the ball of energy she had been suppressing to survive Ingrid's house. Instead of pushing it down, she pulled it up. The change took her breath away, a rush of adrenaline, the snap of bone reshaping, the flood of sensory input. When she opened her eyes, the world was vibrant and sharp. She was on 4 paws, her white fur gleaming in the morning sun. She felt light. The weight of the debt, the shame of the rags, the fear of the cellar, it all vanished under the simple, primitive joy of being a predator. She looked at Therion. He bowed his massive head in a gesture of respect, then turned and bolted toward the tree line. Ivy didn't hesitate. She launched herself after him, her paws tearing up the turf. They ran for miles, weaving through the dense pines, jumping over fallen logs, a blur of shadow and light moving in perfect synchronization. For the first time in years, Ivy wasn't running from a beating, she was running toward her life. Chapter 17. The Duplicate Will. The euphoria of the run had settled into a warm, comfortable ache in Ivy's muscles by the time evening fell over the palace. She sat in Therion's private study, a room dominated by walls of books and a massive fireplace that cast dancing shadows across the floor. Therion was reviewing digital reports on a holographic display, but his attention kept drifting to her, checking on her as if he still couldn't quite believe she was safe. Ivy held a mug of hot tea, staring into the flames. The freedom she had felt in the woods had unlocked something else in her mind, a clarity that pushed past the trauma and focused on the practicalities of justice. Ingrid was still in her home. Ingrid was still spending her money. And King Therion, for all his power, was operating on the assumption that they had to fight a war of influence. He didn't know they held the legal equivalent of a nuclear bomb. "Therion," Ivy said, her voice cutting through the quiet scratching of his stylus. "We need to talk about the estate. About the will." Therion saved his work and swiped the display away, giving her his full attention. "I have the royal solicitors drafting a challenge to Ingrid's claim. It will be difficult without the original document she burned, but with my testimony regarding your treatment, we can likely force a council audit." "We don't need an audit," Ivy said, setting her mug down. "And we don't need to challenge her claim based on hearsay. The document she burned, it wasn't the only one." Therion went still. "Explain." "My father was a high councilman," Ivy began, twisting the ring on her finger. "He dealt with legal contracts for the Pack's land disputes. He knew how easily paper could disappear. He also knew Ingrid. He loved her, in his own way, but he didn't trust her with the family legacy. About 6 months before he got sick, he took me on a camping trip to the Shadow Peaks." "The Shadow Peaks?" Therion frowned. "That's rugged terrain. Not a place for a socialite's husband." "Exactly. We weren't camping. We were visiting Elder Bram." Therion's eyes widened slightly. "Bram the actuary? The wolf who wrote the original Pack Constitution? He's been missing for a decade. Most assume he's dead." "He's not dead," Ivy said. "He's hiding. He lives in a cabin protected by ancient wards that scrambled GPS and scent trails. My father had Bram draft a certified duplicate of his last will and testament. It grants me everything. The house, the accounts, the council seat proxy. It leaves Ingrid with nothing but a stipend, contingent on her good behavior. Bram stamped it with his council seal. It's legally binding and supersedes any previous versions." Therion stood up, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened mountains. "This changes the entire battlefield. If Bram has that document, Ingrid isn't just a greedy widow. She is a criminal occupying stolen land. Why didn't you tell anyone?" "I couldn't," Ivy whispered. "I was a prisoner. If I had tried to run to the mountains and failed, she would have killed me to keep the secret. I was waiting for a chance, but then she sold me to you. And in doing so, she signed her own death warrant," Therion murmured. He tapped his comms device. "Captain Kalen, report to my study immediately. Bring the stealth tactical map." He turned back to Ivy, his expression fierce and protective. "Can you find the cabin on a map?" "I think so," Ivy nodded. "It's near the Black River Fork." "Good," Therion said. "I am dispatching a Shadow Guard unit tonight. We will not risk bringing Bram out in the open yet. We will secure him, protect him, and keep him as our ace in the hole. Ingrid thinks she burned your future in that fireplace. She has no idea that the ashes are about to choke her." Chapter 18. The Gathering Storm. The following morning brought a storm of a different kind. The courier arrived at the palace gates just after dawn, bearing a heavy, cream-colored envelope sealed with the stolen crest of the Gregor family. It was delivered directly to the king's secretary, who brought it to the breakfast table with a look of distaste, sensing the cloying perfume that clung to the paper even after transit. Therion sat at the head of the long table, Ivy to his right. He slit the envelope open with a butter knife, his movements precise and lethal. He pulled out the card, reading the ornate, looping calligraphy that Ingrid favored. He scoffed, a harsh sound that made the footman flinch, and slid the card across the mahogany surface to Ivy. "Your stepmother," Therion said dryly, "has an abundance of audacity." Ivy picked up the invitation. The Gregor estate requests the honor of King Therion's presence at the annual Pack gathering, hosted by Lady Ingrid Gregor, She's hosting, Ivy said, her voice tight with anger. The gathering is supposed to be hosted by the Pack Alpha or the council representative. She has no official rank. She's usurping the position. She is trying to cement her status, Therion explained, buttering his toast calmly. By hosting the regional alphas and royalty, she forces the community to accept her as the de facto leader of the estate. It's a power move. She likely plans to announce engagements for your stepsisters to wealthy suitors, locking in alliances before anyone can question her finances. Ivy stared at the name Lady Ingrid Gregor. It looked so official, so permanent. It made her feel small again, like the girl scrubbing the floors while the party raged in the other room. She thinks I'm gone, Ivy whispered. She thinks I'm peeling potatoes in your kitchen or locked in a dungeon. She feels safe. She feels safe because she assumes I am like every other man she has manipulated, Therion said. She thinks I am satisfied with the transaction. She has no idea who you really are to me. He leaned forward, his golden eyes locking onto hers. We have a choice, Ivy. We can decline. I can send the lawyers and the shadow guard to evict her quietly once Bram is secured. You never have to see her face again. Ivy looked out the window at the sprawling palace grounds, at the life of safety and luxury she had been given. It would be easy to stay here. It would be easy to let Therion handle it. But then she remembered the look on Elder Finch's face when he was arrested. She remembered the hunger. She remembered the silver cuffs. A lawyer's letter was too clean. It was too impersonal. Ingrid loved spectacle. She loved the eyes of the pack. No, Ivy said, her voice gaining strength. She set the invitation down. We go, but we don't tell her I'm coming. If she wants a show, we'll give her one. Therion smiled, and it was a terrifying thing. A surprise inspection. I like it. We will accept the invitation for the king and consort. She will assume I am bringing a random noblewoman. We will let her build her house of cards as high as she likes. And when I walk in, Ivy added, her eyes narrowing, I don't want to look like a survivor. I want to look like a ruler. I want to wear the royal colors. You will wear the crown jewels if you wish, Therion promised. We will return to your home, Ivy. Not to beg for crumbs, but to take the whole loaf. By the time the night is over, Ingrid will wish she had never learned to write her own name. Chapter 19. The Return. The journey back to the Moonlight Pack territory was a study in contrasts. A month ago, Ivy had traveled this road in the back of a royal transport, huddled in a blanket, broken and bleeding, believing her life was over. Now, she sat in the lead vehicle of a heavily armored royal convoy, dressed in a gown of shimmering midnight blue silk that cost more than the entire debt Ingrid had fabricated. Her hair was styled in intricate waves, pinned with diamonds, and around her neck hung the Luna's pendant, a heavy gold medallion that marked her as the second most powerful individual in the kingdom. Yet, despite the silk and the steel surrounding her, Ivy's hands were cold. As the convoy crossed the territory lines, the familiar landscape of her childhood rolled past the tinted windows. She saw the old bridge where she used to fish with her father. She saw the village square where she had once bought ribbons for her mother. It was all the same, yet it felt tainted now, overlaid with the gray filter of her trauma. Breathe. Therion's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road, but his hand found hers on the center console, his thumb rubbing soothing circles into her palm. You are not that girl anymore. You are the Luna. The land reacts to you now, not the other way around. They turned onto the long, winding driveway of the Gregor estate. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grounds. As the mansion came into view, Ivy gasped softly. From a distance, it looked grand, lights blazing from every window. But as they drew closer, the cracks in the facade became visible. The lawns, usually manicured to perfection, were overgrown. Weeds choked the expensive rose bushes her father had prized. The paint on the west wing was peeling. It was subtle, the kind of neglect that came from someone who cared only about the image of wealth, not the maintenance of it. Ingrid was cannibalizing the estate to fund her parties, letting the foundation rot while she gilded the drawing room. "She's destroying it," Ivy murmured, anger replacing her fear. "Look at the stables. The roof is sagging. She hasn't spent a dime on upkeep." "She doesn't expect to hold it long term," Therion observed coldly. "She's looting the ship before it sinks. She plans to marry off her daughters and move on, leaving the husk of the estate behind." The convoy slowed as it reached the main entrance. The circular driveway was jammed with luxury cars. Valets in ill-fitting uniforms were scrambling to park vehicles. The local Pack Alpha, Alpha Kyle, stood by the front steps, looking nervous. Beside him, preening like a peacock in a dress of violent crimson, stood Ingrid. She was flanked by Prissa and Petra, who were giggling and adjusting each other's hair. They looked confident, arrogant, and completely unaware that the Reaper had just pulled into their driveway. "Stay in the car," Therion instructed as the vehicle came to a halt. "Let the anticipation build. I will go in first. I will secure the room. When the signal is given, Kaelin will escort you. I want them to see me and think they are safe. I want them to relax. And then I want you to shatter them." He squeezed her hand one last time, his golden eyes fierce. "Remember, Ivy, you own the ground you walk on. Make them feel it." Chapter 20. The Mockery. The great hall of the Gregor estate was a cacophony of noise and forced gaiety. Ingrid had packed the room with every influential wolf within 100 miles, creating a crushing density of bodies and egos. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, champagne, and the underlying musk of shifters posturing for status. A string quartet played in the corner, though they were barely audible over the roar of conversation. Ingrid was in her element. She moved through the crowd with a glass of vintage wine in one hand, accepting compliments on the decor while ignoring the fact that the wine cellar was now empty. She felt invincible. The king had accepted her invitation. This was the seal of approval she needed. Once Therion appeared and publicly acknowledged her as the hostess, no one on the council would dare question her handling of the finances. She found her daughters near the buffet table. Prissa and Petra were holding court with a group of young, wealthy male heirs from the neighboring pack. They were laughing loudly, their voices shrill and grating. "Oh, stop it!" Prissa giggled, slapping the arm of a young wolf. "We didn't exile her. That sounds so dramatic. We just found her a job that suited her skill set." "Scrubbing floors," Petra chimed in, snorting into her drink. "Mother says she's probably peeling potatoes for the royal army by now. Can you imagine? Ivy Gregor, the princess, knee-deep in potato skins?" The group erupted in laughter. Ingrid joined them, placing a hand on Petra's shoulder. "Now, girls, be kind. Ivy always did prefer the simple life. We did her a favor, really. She would have been overwhelmed trying to manage an estate like this. It requires refinement." Ingrid touched the necklace at her throat, a heavy diamond choker that had belonged to Ivy's mother. It sparkled under the chandelier light, a stolen trophy worn without a shred of guilt. "Besides," Ingrid continued, lowering her voice for dramatic effect, "we all know she wasn't quite right in the head toward the end. The jealousy she had for my girls, it was dangerous. I sleep much better knowing she is far, far away." "To the simple life," one of the suitors toasted, raising his glass. "To trash being taken out," Prissa added, clinking her glass against his. The mockery was interrupted by the sudden booming sound of the heavy oak doors slamming open against the walls. The music stopped abruptly. The conversation died. A hush fell over the room as the crowd turned toward the entrance. King Therion stood there. He was alone, framed by the darkness of the night outside. He wore a tuxedo of severe black cut, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply scanned the room with those terrifying golden eyes, looking at the guests as if they were insects crawling on a picnic blanket. Ingrid gasped, a thrill of victory shooting through her. He was here. She smoothed her crimson dress, pasted a dazzling smile on her face, and stepped forward, dragging her daughters with her. She marched right up to the most dangerous predator on the continent, oblivious to the storm brewing in his eyes. "Your Majesty," she trilled, dipping into a low theatrical curtsy. "Welcome to Gregor Manor. We are humbled by your presence. Truly, you honor us." She gestured to Prisa and Petra, who were batting their eyelashes furiously. "May I present my daughters? They have been counting the minutes to your arrival." Therion looked down at them. He looked at the diamond choker on Ingrid's neck. He looked at the silk dresses on the stepsisters. He looked at the smirks they hadn't quite managed to wipe off their faces. "You seem to be celebrating," Therion said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "We are celebrating unity," Ingrid beamed, "and the bright future of this estate." "Is that what this is?" Therion asked, tilting his head slightly. "I thought perhaps you were celebrating a successful sale. Tell me, Lady Gregor, did you spend the 50,000 credits you thought you were getting? Or is this party funded by the heirlooms you stole from the dead?" Chapter 21. The Reveal. Ingrid's face had gone the color of spoiled milk at Therion's accusation, but her survival instinct was a powerful, if desperate thing. She forced a hollow laugh, waving her hand as if to dispel the king's words like cigar smoke. The guests shifted uncomfortably, the tension in the room ratcheting up as they sensed the predator in their midst was toying with its prey. Ingrid opened her mouth to speak, to spin another lie about the jewelry, but Therion turned away from her, dismissing her existence with a turn of his heel. He faced the massive double doors of the great hall, raised his hand, and snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence like a whip crack. The doors, which had partially closed after Therion's entrance, swung wide open again. But this time, the darkness of the night was illuminated by the soft, ethereal glow of the courtyard lights, framing the figure standing on the threshold. A collective intake of breath sucked the oxygen out of the room. Standing in the doorway was not a foreign dignitary, nor a random noblewoman. It was a vision of regal power that seemed to absorb the light and reflect it back tenfold. The woman was dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk, the fabric shimmering like the night sky, tailored to accentuate a figure that radiated strength and grace. Her hair, polished to a dark luster, cascaded down her back in waves, crowned by a delicate yet unmistakable circlet of woven white gold, the traditional headpiece of a royal Luna. Ivy Gregor stepped into the hall. She did not walk with the hurried, head-down shuffle of the servant girl the pack remembered. She moved with a fluid, predatory elegance, her chin held high, her green eyes sweeping across the room with a cold, assessing clarity. Every step she took was a declaration of war. The click of her heels on the marble floor echoed in the silence, a rhythmic countdown to Ingrid's destruction. As Ivy moved into the light of the chandeliers, recognition began to dawn on the crowd. It started as a ripple of whispers near the back, then a wave of gasps that traveled forward until it crashed over the front row. The socialites who had ignored her for years, the men who had mocked her, the staff who had turned a blind eye, they all stared, paralyzed by the impossibility of what they were seeing. Ingrid stood frozen, her glass slipping from her numb fingers to shatter on the floor. She stared at the woman approaching her, her brain refusing to process the visual information. It looked like Ivy, but it couldn't be. Ivy was broken. Ivy was sold. Ivy was a dirty secret buried in the royal kitchens. This woman was a titan. Prissa and Petra, lacking their mother's shock-induced paralysis, let out audible squeaks of horror. They clutched each other, their pastel dresses suddenly looking cheap and childish next to the royal silk Ivy wore. They shrank back as Ivy stopped 3 feet from them, flanking the king. Therion reached out and took Ivy's hand, raising it to his lips in a gesture of absolute devotion and submission that sent a shockwave through the room. He kissed her knuckles, his golden eyes never leaving Ingrid's face. "Allow me to introduce my guest." Therion's voice was a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. "And my host. This is Ivy Gregor, my mate, my Luna, and the true owner of the house you are standing in." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Ivy released Therion's hand and took a step closer to her stepmother. She looked at the woman who had tormented her for a decade, seeing not a monster, but a small, pathetic creature drowning in borrowed finery. Ivy's gaze dropped to the heavy diamond choker around Ingrid's neck. "Hello, stepmother," Ivy said, her voice smooth and cool, like water flowing over ice. "I believe you are wearing something that belongs to me." Ingrid's hand flew to her throat, clutching the diamonds protectively. Her eyes darted around the room, seeing the judgment forming on the faces of the pack. Panic, hot and irrational, clawed at her throat. She couldn't lose. Not here. Not in front of everyone. "You!" Ingrid stammered, her voice shrill and shaking. "You imposter! How dare you! You are nothing but a runaway servant. You stole that dress. You stole those jewels." She pointed a trembling finger at Therion. "She has bewitched you. She is a liar and a thief." The accusation hung in the air, gross and desperate. Ivy didn't scream back. She didn't argue. She simply tilted her head, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "A thief?" she repeated softly. "I am not the one wearing a dead woman's necklace while standing on a grave I refuse to tend." Ivy raised her hand, and the heavy signet ring of the Luna, bearing the royal crest, flashed in the light. "I am giving you one chance, Ingrid. Take it off, or I will have the guards remove it for you." Chapter 22. The King's Roar. Ingrid looked at the ring, then at the crowd, and finally at the king. The walls were closing in, and the illusion of power she had crafted so carefully was disintegrating like wet paper. But Ingrid Gregor did not know how to surrender. She only knew how to attack. The humiliation of being commanded by the stepdaughter she had enslaved was too much for her narcissism to bear. "I will do no such thing!" Ingrid shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysteria that grated on the ears. "Guards! Security! Arrest this girl! She is a bonded debtor. She belongs to this estate. She is property." She turned to the local pack enforcers standing by the walls, gesturing wildly. "Do your jobs! Seize her! She is a fugitive!" The enforcers shifted uneasily, looking from the screaming woman in the red dress to the massive, silent king standing beside her. None of them moved. They were corrupt, but they were not suicidal. Ingrid, seeing her commands ignored, lost the last shred of her composure. She lunged forward, her hand raised as if to strike Ivy, a reflex born of years of unchecked abuse. "You ungrateful little wretch! I should have killed you when your father died. I will not let you ruin me." The moment her intent to harm became clear, the air in the room changed instantly. It wasn't a gradual shift, it was a violent, atmospheric slam. King Therion didn't move to block her. He didn't need to. He simply released the leash on his alpha aura. It hit the room like a physical shockwave, a crushing weight of pure, unadulterated dominance that dropped from the ceiling like an anvil. The chandeliers rattled violently, the glass crystals chiming in terror. Every wolf in the room, from the lowest Omega to the visiting alphas, felt their knees buckle. It was a biological imperative, a command written into their DNA that screamed, "Submit." Hundreds of guests dropped to the floor in unison, the sound of knees hitting marble echoing like a drum roll. Drinks were spilled, trays were dropped, but no one dared to move. The pressure was suffocating, a heavy blanket of power that made it difficult to draw a breath. Ingrid, caught mid-lunge, was slammed to the ground as if a giant hand had swatted her out of the air. She hit the floor hard, gasping, her face pressed against the cold stone she had forced Ivy to scrub for years. Prissa and Petra were already huddled in a ball, sobbing silently, crushed under the weight of the king's fury. Therion took a step forward. The sound of his boot hitting the floor was the only noise in the cavernous hall. He didn't shout. He didn't roar. He spoke in a voice that was terrifyingly calm, yet it carried to every corner of the room, vibrating through the floorboards and into the bones of the prostrate guests. "I warned you," Therion said, looking down at Ingrid's trembling form. "I told you that if you ever spoke against my mate again, you would lose your tongue. And yet, here you are, ordering an attack on your queen." He crouched down, bringing his face level with hers. His eyes were entirely gold, the human part of him submerged beneath the ancient, lethal instinct of the alpha. You called her property. You called her a slave. Look around you, Ingrid. Look at your guests. Look at your daughters. Everyone is on their knees except her, because she is the only one worthy of standing. Therion stood up slowly, the aura pulsing around him in waves of dark energy. You wanted a show? You wanted the pack to witness your glory? They are watching. They are watching you crawl. He turned to the room, raising his voice to address the terrified assembly. This woman, he gestured to Ingrid, sold Ivy Gregor to me. She forged a debt. She enslaved a free citizen, and she attempted to defraud the royal crown. Does anyone here wish to stand in her defense? Does anyone wish to claim she is the rightful alpha of this estate? Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. Not a single hand was raised. Not a single voice spoke up. The friends Ingrid had bought, the suitors she had courted, they all kept their heads bowed, terrified of drawing the king's gaze. Good, Therion said, the pressure lifting just enough to allow them to breathe, but not enough to stand. Then let us finish this properly. He turned to Ivy, his expression softening instantly. My queen, the floor is yours. Chapter 23. The Truth Unveiled. Ivy stood tall amidst the sea of bowed heads, the only figure upright besides her king. She looked down at Ingrid, who was gasping for air, her makeup smeared on the marble, the crimson dress pooled around her like spilled blood. There was no pity in Ivy's heart, only a cold, focused resolve. She didn't want violence. She wanted the truth. She wanted the stain on her father's name scrubbed clean, and she knew exactly how to do it. She raised her hand, signaling the royal guard stationed at the main entrance. Open the doors, she commanded, her voice clear and steady, utilizing the lunatone that compelled obedience. Bring them in. The double doors swung open for the third time that night. 2 royal guards marched in, flanked by a tactical unit. Between them walked 2 men. One was Elder Finch, looking thin and battered from his time in the pack's holding cells but walking with his head high. The other was a figure who seemed to have stepped out of a history book. An elderly wolf with wild gray hair, leaning on a gnarly wooden staff, wearing the heavy, dust-colored robes of a high actuary. A gasp went through the room, low and startled. The older members of the pack recognized him instantly. Elder Bram, the man who was supposed to be dead, or at least gone forever. Ingrid lifted her head, squinting through her tear-blurred vision. When she saw Bram, the blood drained from her face so completely she looked like a corpse. She tried to scramble backward, her heels skidding on the floor, but she had nowhere to go. No, she whispered, a sound of pure horror. You were gone. You were gone. I was hiding, Bram corrected, his voice raspy but projecting with the authority of the council. He stopped in the center of the hall, flanked by the guards. He looked at Ingrid with profound disgust. Hiding from the snakes my friend Gregor warned me about. But the queen found me. Bram reached into his robes and pulled out a scroll case made of heavy brass. He unscrewed the cap and withdrew a sheet of parchment. It wasn't a copy. It was a pristine, formal document, glowing faintly with the magical seal of the High Council. This, Bram announced, holding the document up for the pack to see, is the true last will and testament of Councilman Gregor, signed, witnessed, and magically sealed 6 months prior to his death. It supersedes all other documents, real or forged. He unrolled it and began to read. I, Councilman Gregor, being of sound mind, hereby leave my entire estate, including all land, liquid assets, investments, and personal property, to my sole biological daughter, Ivy Gregor. Bram paused, looking over his spectacles at Ingrid. Furthermore, regarding my wife, Ingrid, due to concerns regarding her spending and treatment of my daughter, she is to receive a one-time stipend of 5,000 credits, contingent upon her immediately vacating the premises. If she challenges this will, or if any harm befalls my daughter, she is to be stripped of all assets and exiled from the territory. The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The guests began to murmur. 5,000 credits? It was a pittance, A insult. It was Gregor's final laugh. He hadn't just cut her out, he had anticipated her treachery. Elder Finch stepped forward, holding a datapad. "I can also testify," Finch added, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "that Lady Ingrid planted the jewelry in my briefcase to frame me and prevent the reading of the previous draft. She imprisoned an officer of the court to hide her theft." The pack turned on her. It was instantaneous. The wolves who had been drinking her wine and laughing at her jokes suddenly looked at her with revulsion. Theft, forgery, slavery, treason. The crimes were piling up, turning her into a pariah in seconds. Ingrid looked around wildly, seeing no allies, only judgment. She looked at Prissa and Petra, who were weeping openly, realizing their life of luxury was over. She looked at Ivy, expecting to see gloating. Instead, she saw a mirror. Ivy was looking at her with the same impassive, cold expression Ingrid had worn when she burned the will. "You burned a decoy," Ivy said softly. "You burned a piece of paper and thought you burned my life. But you forgot, Ingrid. Fire purifies. It clears away the rot so something new can grow." Ivy turned to the local alpha, Kale, who was still on his knees. "Alpha Kale, please stand. As the rightful owner of this estate, I formally press charges against Ingrid Gregor and her accomplices for fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and the attempted sale of a pack member." Alpha Kale scrambled to his feet, eager to distance himself from the wreckage of the Gregor family. "Charges accepted, Luna. The penalty for treason against the royal house is death. Shall we prepare the execution block?" Chapter 24. The Mercy of the Queen. The word death sucked the last bit of air out of the room. Prissa and Petra screamed, clutching their mother's skirts. Ingrid went limp, staring blankly at the floor. Execution. It was the standard punishment for selling a wolf into slavery, especially when the victim was a royal mate. The pack waited, holding their breath, expecting the order. Therion stood with his arms crossed, his face grim. He would happily carry out the sentence himself. Ivy looked at the woman huddled on the floor. She remembered the hunger. She remembered the cold nights in the attic. She remembered the bruises. A part of her, the angry, hurt child, wanted to see Ingrid pay with her blood. But as she looked at the terrified, pathetic trio, she realized that death was too easy. Death was an escape. It was a quick end to their humiliation. "No," Ivy said, her voice ringing clear in the silent hall. "There will be no blood on my floor tonight. I just had it polished." Therion looked at her, raising an eyebrow, but he didn't intervene. He trusted her judgment. "Execution is the punishment for a threat," Ivy continued, walking slowly around Ingrid. "But you are not a threat to me, Ingrid. You never were. You were just a bully who got lucky for a while. Killing you would make you a martyr to your own vanity." She stopped in front of Alpha Kale. "I choose mercy. But mercy has a price." Ivy turned back to her stepfamily. "You want to live in this territory? You want to avoid exile to the rogue lands where you wouldn't last a week? Fine. You can stay." Hope flickered in Ingrid's eyes. "Thank you. Thank you, Ivy. We will go. We will move to the city." "I didn't say you could leave." Ivy cut her off sharply. "The will states you must vacate the main house. It does not say you have to leave the land. There is a structure on the southern edge of the property. The old farmhouse." Ingrid's face fell. The farmhouse was a ruin. It had no heating, a leaking roof, and was used to store fertilizer. It was where Ingrid had threatened to send Ivy a dozen times. "You, Prissa, and Petra will live there," Ivy decreed. "You will not receive a stipend. You will work for your keep. I am converting this estate into a sanctuary and business center for the pack. We will need a cleaning staff. You three seem to have experience making messes. Now you will learn to clean them up." "You can't be serious," Prissa wailed. "We are high-born." "You are debtors," Ivy corrected. "You owe the estate 500,000 credits in stolen funds. You will work it off at minimum wage, scrubbing floors, washing linens, cleaning the toilets. If you refuse, or if you miss a shift, the deal is void, and you will be exiled to the wastelands. Do you accept?" Ingrid looked at the king, seeing no mercy in his eyes. She looked at the angry pack. She looked at the farmhouse in her mind. It was a prison, but it was life. She bowed her head, her spirit finally, truly broken. We accept. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the stone terrace of the Gregor sanctuary. The estate had been transformed. The weeds were gone, replaced by blooming gardens. The mansion was no longer a silent mausoleum of greed. It was a bustling hub of activity, housing a school for young shifters and a legal clinic run by Elder Finch. Ivy stood on the balcony, leaning against the railing, watching the activity below. She wore a simple dress of white linen, her hair loose and blowing in the breeze. She looked healthy, strong, and at peace. Strong arms wrapped around her waist from behind, and she leaned back into Therian's chest, humming contentedly as he kissed the side of her neck. "The council meeting went well?" she asked, resting her hands over his. "It was boring," Therian murmured into her hair. "They talked too much. I missed you." He turned her around, his golden eyes filled with warmth. "Are you happy, my queen?" "I am," Ivy smiled, looking over his shoulder toward the main entrance. Down below, on the grand porch she used to scrub, 3 figures in gray, shapeless uniforms were on their hands and knees. Ingrid, Prissa, and Petra were scrubbing the mud from the boots of the visiting students. They looked tired. They looked miserable. They were bickering over who had to carry the heavy bucket of soapy water. Ingrid looked up for a moment, shielding her eyes from the sun. She saw Ivy on the balcony, wrapped in the arms of the king. For a second, their eyes met. There was no defiance left in Ingrid, only the crushing weight of regret. She looked back down and continued scrubbing. Ivy turned back to Therian, pulling his face down for a kiss. The past was a stain they had washed away. The future was bright, and it belonged entirely to her. "I am home," she whispered, and for the first time in her life, she truly meant it.